was reading this article about whether or not it's worth it to fight elites in Slay the Spire 2. And it was really interesting to me because I personally felt like it could be the same arguments for Slay the Spire 1. And then, as I read deeper and heard the writer's experience with the game, the fact that the elites seemed somewhat harder, to me it just sounded like this is how roguelike elites are. And then I got to the line, I haven't cleared a run with anyone yet. And I started to realize why this article seemed weird to me. All of the arguments they were making could have been valid. They could have been credible, and honestly, I can understand. Elites a lot of times are really tough. But without having beaten a run, they wrote an article, and now people will read it, many of whom may not even get to that line. That is why I'm making this video. Because I am shocked at the amount of game journalism out there that continuously misrepresents gaming and gamers themselves by being the voice of the industry. I've been wanting to talk about game journalism for a while now, but I thought with a subject area like this, it's really important to develop and research and actually learn about the subject area before talking about it. And then I realized that I've spent more hours in Deadlock in the past week than the average game reviewer does for a new game anyway. It was actually 3 years ago with this Penguins video. You see, Penguins is arguing that the first place to go to AI is going to be game journalists, which as someone who has a journalism degree, I felt kind of offended by this. But he's not wrong whatsoever. I think this is because game journalists have written themselves into a corner where no one wants to read their articles except to make fun of them. And I think that's really bad. But the first point I want to talk about is the fact that most of these people aren't real journalists. I think we use the term game journalist because it's easy to say rather than reviewer, but critics and journalists are not the same. Journalists report on things, oftentimes with bias or without, depending on the type of journalist they are. However, a reviewer is completely and fully about their bias and opinions. I think the state of game journalism is really important for this discussion. There are plenty of articles out there about how game journalists have extremely short deadlines, how oftentimes their whole job is to get clicks on the website. But I think for all the excuses that game journalists have at their disposal, they also just have a lack of understanding of basic journalistic principles. Not to be a journalism teacher for a second, but most journalism organizations follow the Tippy Cup guideline. You don't need all of these necessarily to have a good article, but you need to follow these to an extent. Reviews, most of the time, do not properly follow these. Usually this is where articles need to stand to have some level of value. I think the other way that game journalists tend to drop the whole journalist aspect is by the fact that they bury the lead. You want the most important information at the top, but because these places are click farms, they oftentimes bury the lead super deep. So why would you even read these articles in the first place when you can just read the headline and get the gist that you need? While these writers do have a bad lack of journalistic understanding, there's also just as many people on the flip side where they are journalists from one industry or another, and somehow they get roped in from tech or entrepreneurship into the gaming sphere, and all of a sudden you have a journalist who never wanted to be in the gaming industry in the industry. And I think this is why a lot of times game journalists are extremely bad at the games they're playing. These people are having to play all sorts of games, so even if you were interested in one or another, you likely aren't going to be as good in all of them. I think for me, I'm a great example. I really love roguelikes, and I enjoy shooters as well, but I'm not very good at them. And so for me, I'm in this weird niche of, yes, I like roguelike aspects. That's really what I'm good at. However, I probably put way more hours into things like Deadlock or TF2. Risk of Rain 2 is like the perfect bread and butter for me. But generally, I try and stay in the sphere of roguelike. Oh shit, I hit the ceiling there. Yikes. Normally I try and stay in the sphere of roguelikes or shooters, but every once in a while I'll play a farming game or I'll play a factory game. I wouldn't write an article about those. And I think that's the problem for game journalists is to make their money, they do have to write those articles. That brings me to another point. So many people are leaving the industry or being replaced in the industry. Penguins did a video a while ago, which is actually the first time I wanted to talk about game journalism, about how AI is likely going to take over game journalists' jobs.
AI technology has reached a point where it could legitimately take all of game journalists' jobs in only like a couple years.
Now, when this first came out, I really wanted to do a video countering his points, but the problem that I came up with is I'm not trying to defend game journalists. They really haven't earned the respect of journalists in the industry. Professors in my journalism school would constantly talk about how bad these articles were because most of these people aren't real writers to begin with. They just happen to fall into the position. But then on top of that, the things they're writing about doesn't garner respect from the audience either. So Penguins was 100% right. They are going to be replaced by AI. And then of course, recently AI started replacing game journalists. So I really couldn't refute his point. However, I wanted to at the time. And that's really a huge part of this is people are leaving, people are being replaced. And so the aura of the industry is very negative and people generally do not feel comfortable, which means they can't write the articles that they want to write. So I think it's really interesting. But that leads us into Mouse PI. If you know anything about the news with Mouse PI lately, IGN wrote an article and gave them a review. I don't think in a lot of ways the review is necessarily incorrect. This reviewer is a huge fan of noir as a genre. They are extremely passionate about the style of movies from that era, and you would think that they'd be a great person to review Mouse PI. However, rather than reviewing it from the basis of this game is clearly satire, it's supposed to be this cartoon style that not necessarily always has to make sense, they are reviewing it as an art form, which I think might legitimately be part of their arguments in there somewhere. And so for them, noir as the art form and genre has been smeared and it's grayed in this video game in a way that they don't necessarily like. Now, I also want to know what this author's take is going to be on Spider-Man Noir. I think it'll be really interesting to see what that looks like. However, they do have other articles as well. For instance, they gave a bunch of sports ball games like a 7 or an 8, which I think is interesting because the realism in these sports games isn't necessarily accurate either. So you begin to question as a reviewer, not as a journalist, but as a reviewer, where their boundaries lie. That leads me into the reality of these game institutions. They need clicks. While I don't necessarily think they wrote this article to garner more clicks, I do think that IGN chose this reviewer on purpose. This is a person who loves noir, is a diehard noir fan, and likely isn't the right person to be talking about Mouse PI. I don't even think there's any related games in their review history. So you begin to wonder why IGN did this. Did they know that this person would write a very negative review and garner them thousands and thousands of page views just to go read this one article? I think in a way, yes. I think this legitimately is a click farm where they're trying to get as many people to come as possible, and they know that if they have articles which are negative in some way, or especially if they have articles that garner reaction, they will get more money. And I think if you've ever went on IGN's page, you can definitely see it and feel it, because I've never had a web page load so poorly other than IGN. I mean, I don't understand how they fill. I mean, they've got to be mining crypto in the background or something. I don't know what they're doing to make their websites load so slowly. I think to an extent, I've already talked about this as well, but these people, they're not necessarily journalists. They're reviewers. And I think critics and reviewers have an amazing place in the industry, especially as writers. Some of these people are some of the best writers I've ever seen. They can really put a lot of emotion and personality into things that they're reviewing. Other people are just reviewing stuff. Not trying to diminish it. Reporters, all they do is report on things. It's something, if you were there, you wouldn't need the reporter anyway. That's kind of how a reviewer is as well. But the thing is, game journalism as an industry rarely has any hard-hitting journalism. When was the last time you had either a streamer talk to you about an article, you read an article, or one of your friends mentioned an article about some big investigative thing happening in the gaming space? What was the last time someone told you about this crazy piece of data that totally blew the water on some organization within gaming, or the fact that, hey, AAA gaming kind of sucks and the indie space is where it's at? When was the last time you read an article like that? The one space in my entire life that I don't read the news about is gaming, because most of the time it's unimportant. It's PR. I mean, it is literally press releases for game companies at this point. It's not real journalism. And I think that's why so many people dislike game journalism compared to like your local news. They aren't reporting for you, they're reporting for a large organization. And this leads into bad framing. Game journalists frame everything in a terrible way. We frame all of our arguments as if the game journalists are some type of industry authority. But the reality is they're not. They're a human being just like anyone else, but they're a human being with a lot of power and responsibility. By being the arbiter of the gaming topic, these people oftentimes can sway a lot of people into buying games. Concord is a great example. IGN or Polygon or someone gave them a very high rated review. So then multiple people ended up buying the game because they're like, this is going to be the next big thing. I also want to talk about Concord for a second. IGN literally said that the player models for this, or the characters, were charming and unique. Are we looking at the same thing? This argument is shocking to me in a number of ways. I don't find this charming and unique whatsoever. Now this over here, like Mouse PI, charming, unique, different. When was the last time there was a hand-drawn video game like this? Oh shit. Oh damn, do they just not like hand-drawn? I think it's important to talk about bias for a second. Game journalists are extremely biased. They are either being paid by these large AAA companies. If they're not being paid, they're at least being incentivized to give a nicer review of these companies. Because of that bias, they're not going to oust a big company and say their game is not that good, too many bad jokes in it, and hey, by the way, we're going to put you on the lower half. We're going to give you a C grade rather than actually putting you at a B or above. That being said, all this bias they have gives into my bias a little bit. I am extremely jealous of video game journalists. They're in an industry that I would love to be a part of. They're writers who are getting to use their specific skill set to share stories or information to thousands and thousands of people. Of course, I would be jealous to an extent. That is literally one of the things I've wanted to do my entire life. A lot of my drive to talk about video game journalism is because of the fact that these people have a job that I really wish I could have. So that's where my bias comes in. It's completely out of jealousy to an extent. And that, I think, is also a big reason why the internet kind of bandwagons on to these people. When someone writes a bad article or bad review for a game, it's really frustrating to people who have to work a normal 9 to 5, who only get to play video games on their off hours and sometimes can't even play the games that they want because maybe they can't afford them. For someone who gets games for free, who plays them as part of their job, to do a really shitty review of games. And I think that's the heart of why everyone really hates game journalists, is they arguably have one of the best jobs in the world. They get to play video games for a living, and yet half of them don't want to play video games for a living. It's such a weird problem to have. I really wish that game journalists would find a happy balance of being able to have fun with their job and enjoy the games that they play, but also be journalists. That all being said, I think it's just such a tough space because most of their pay comes from those clicks and those reactions that people have. So of course they're going to follow the drama or make drama of their own or make bold claims when they have nothing to talk about anyway. Can we go back to Slay the Spire 2 for a second? This article was like 90% of the reason that I made this video. I think it's crazy for someone to say that they haven't beaten a run yet and to then talk about how elites, which are the mini boss of the game, are too hard and therefore they're not worth it fighting. That's like the whole point of an elite, is that you fight them for the bonus rewards. Now, I know they're saying that there aren't that many rewards for an elite because half of the relics suck. I think they just don't know how to use the relics correctly. There are so many relics that you can get in Slay the Spire that if you're an outside player, you might think, oh, cause vulnerable for one turn, cause weak for one turn. That's like the shittiest item in the game, but those are really valuable, especially when you need AoE, because all of the enemies in the lineup get that applied. I'm really hoping I can find some clips to like emphasize my point here. If you don't know much about the game, which if you've never beaten the game, you wouldn't know much about the game, you're going to have a tough time being able to talk about the meta-analysis of the game. I think this Slay the Spire article really sums it up for me. This writer clearly does not know the reward system of the game, nor the enemy system of Slay the Spire. Did you know that Slay the Spire, as you continue to fight normal enemies, you will eventually get into a harder pool of enemies that are nearly the same difficult as elites anyway? You might not if you've never played Slay the Spire that much. But that is one of the reasons why it's typically best to take 1 or 2 elite fights each floor. Then, instead of having to fight a normal enemy, you at least get the relic, the potion, the better card reward, and I believe extra gold as well from an elite. I think it's really telling that an article such as this it's almost like no one reads it, and the people who are reading it are recognizing that it indeed is probably not the best to talk about it when you haven't beaten the game yet. I also think it's telling too when you have comments saying don't listen to people, this game is ass. Because the people who are enjoying these articles are the people who aren't enjoying the games. And the people who, when they enjoy the articles and say, IGN had another masterpiece, or finally get this guy writing all of the IGN reviews, that happens because what people want at the end of the day is not journalism. They don't want reporting or investigation or anything like that. What they want is to have their opinion shared or have their opinion echoed. Okay, we're gonna sit on the floor now. I hope that this is like a good shot and not just like full crotch. I'm really passionate about this topic. I think it has to do with a lot of things, but I think at the end of the day, it's largely because I consider myself to an extent a journalist. I would call myself a writer far before I called myself a journalist. But compared to video game journalists, in a lot of ways, I do feel like a journalist. I research the industry, I write out points and subject areas that I think are important, and I really try and dig into the facts behind everything, which is something that I don't think truly happens in the video game industry. I think it's such a weird culmination of passion versus positioning versus ad placement and things like that, that it's an extremely tough industry to be in. I don't think there's any greater example than stuff like Jeff Cayley with Highguard. I don't think Highguard failed because, it was overhyped or because there's genre fatigue or anything like that. Highguard was just generally a bad video game. I think the people who say otherwise are slightly cooked. Yes, it could have had great mechanics, but at the same time, a 3v3 doesn't make sense for a large battle arena. It just doesn't, and especially with the setup. I oftentimes think that games minimize themselves for no apparent reason other than sometimes it gets too unruly. But then you have actual masterpieces like Team Fortress 2, which are 12v12. When was the last time you played a game with that many characters in it? Yeah, TF2, that's what I thought. I also think Highguard failed because it tried to do too many things at once. And while sometimes a lot of things can be a really cool opportunity, just like with anything, oftentimes less is more. I think TF2 is a great example. I think even further than that, there are a ton of roguelikes that are prime examples of this. The base concept of the game is very simple. Get as many points as possible, reach the end of these levels, yada yada. The way you get there is what's the complexity. I think it's harder to do that in multiplayer games. But at the same time, you take something like Rainbow Six Siege, for instance, which is very much just like get to this objective. And all of a sudden, it's actually really complex with just that one base point. And I think that's really interesting. But I think the game industry, as an industry, has gotten too complex with things. I think there is a lot of bias and bandwagon in the internet. Gamers tend to review things negatively because a lot of times you're spending money on this thing that's entertainment when you didn't necessarily have to buy a new game because you had 100 games in your backlog anyway because your Steam library is huge. I think that is at the heart of it. A big thing is this is a really big pain point for a lot of people, and it's also one of the only escapes for a lot of people who would love nothing more to have their day job be writing about video games. I hope that came across well. I hope this edit goes well. I'm so sorry to future me for having to edit all these incoherent thoughts in different positions. At the end of the day, I'm just like a guy at a green screen. If you liked the video, you should subscribe. I'm gonna do more of these green screen videos, partially because I think they're easier for me to do. It's just faster for me to record like this instead of trying to write a script. I think that makes a little bit more sense. We'll get more coherent as we go. If you enjoyed, you should definitely check out, I put together a playlist of other videos about video game journalism. It has some fun ones in there that I think are really great. And then also too, you should check out some of my other videos. I think this one is probably the closest to this video, but this is my first video in this green screen style. But feel free to comment. I love to chat about this subject. Bye for now.